Before we begin, let me whisper something imprudent into the quiet cave of your night. Not all angels arrive to comfort. Some arrive to file complaints. And it was precisely those angels, the ones with too many wings and too little patience, who once terrified the church more than any heretic ever could. Strange, isn't it, that the very beings sculpted in marble to reassure believers were, in the oldest stories, the ones who sent abbots trembling, bishops fainting, and entire councils rewriting theology just to avoid another celestial audit. But perhaps that is always the way. The holiest things are frightening, and the people most convinced of their holiness are frightened most of all. Even now, as your room softens into that nocturnal blue where silence stretches like a monastic hallway, you might feel a small tug, not of fear, but of curiosity. That subtle, spiritual itch that says something old, something dust-covered, something inconveniently divine is about to be unburied. And you, yes, you, are sitting there pretending you're only here for gentle background noise, when you and I both know you want to hear the secret the church never wanted written on parchment. Before you convince yourself this is just something to fall asleep to, do your part, like the video and subscribe. Not because I asked, no, that would be far too mortal of a reason, but because perhaps, just perhaps, some corner of your soul wants the algorithm's light to shine upon you, the way saints once begged for God's. If you feel that inexplicable pull, you'll know what to do. And if you don't, well, neither did half the prophets. Now listen, the story begins, as these stories always do, with something that shouldn't have happened but did, a small fracture in the expected order of holiness, the kind of delicate crack that appears not with thunder, but with a sigh so soft that only one man heard it. Brother Aurelio, a monk whose piety was, let's say, enthusiastic in public and somewhat negotiable in private. Aurelio lived in a monastery perched precariously on a cliff above a forest that looked like it had been designed by an architect who enjoyed unnecessary gloom. Pines crowded the slopes like penitents, too ashamed to lift their heads. The wind there was always cold, even in summer, and it carried the perpetual smell of incense, though no one knew whether that came from the chapel or from the ghosts of overly ambitious rituals conducted centuries earlier. Every night, the monks would gather in the stone chapel, illuminated by candles that flickered with the theatricality of minor saints trying to be noticed. And every night, Aurelio would kneel in the same place, on the same creaky wooden board, whispering prayers that were half devotion and half an attempt to remind God that he still existed. But on that night, that deliciously ironic night, the candles flickered in a way that was not theatrical, but nervous. Even the shadows seemed unsure of their roles. Aurelio knelt, exhaled, and felt the usual spiritual emptiness echo politely within him, the way a guest nods during a boring dinner speech. He was ready for the routine, ready to mutter the same liturgical lines he had memorized more out of monastic peer pressure than any burning inner certainty, ready to listen to the abbot recite psalms as though he had personally edited them. But then, without thunder, without celestial trumpets, without the dramatic soundtrack angels surely deserved, something shifted in the air. Not a breeze, not a sound, just a pressure, like the silence itself leaning forward to take a better look. Aurelio, who often mistook indigestion for mystical experience, blinked and assumed he was imagining things. But imagination rarely smells like burning parchment. Imagination rarely makes the stone floor vibrate with microscopic tremors, as if something ancient were walking somewhere beneath it. Imagination rarely feels like a presence standing behind you, reading over your shoulder, judging your prayer posture. He turned slowly, and there, halfway submerged in the wavering candlelight, stood an angel. Now, before your mind conjures the soft, pastel-winged cherubs of greeting cards, no. This was the older kind, the kind carved on cathedral doors to discourage sinners from entering, the kind described by prophets who probably regretted seeing one. Too many eyes, too many wings, too much divine honesty. Aurelio's first thought was not, "Oh, glory." It was, naturally, "Oh, no. Someone from heaven is here to check the paperwork." You see, the monks believed, quite sincerely, that angels appeared only to the exceptionally holy or to the exceptionally doomed, and Aurelio was painfully aware that he belonged to neither category. His holiness hovered somewhere between respectable enthusiasm and, well, he tries. And his doom, while possible, seemed more administrative than dramatic. The angel looked at him the way a cosmic auditor might look at someone who filed their spiritual taxes incorrectly for the 5th consecutive year. Aurelio opened his mouth, but the angel spoke first, not aloud, but in that intrusive, celestial way that feels like someone rearranging the furniture inside your head. Where, the presence intoned with all the solemnity of a divine reprimand, is your church. Aurelio blinked, looked around, pointed. Here. The angel's wings folded in a gesture that suggested divine disappointment of an advanced degree. This, the voice echoed, is not the church. This is merely where the church hides from the angels. Which was, Aurelio thought, a rather rude evaluation of the monastery's architecture. But the angel wasn't finished. We have come, and they are not ready. They were never ready. Aurelio swallowed, though his throat suddenly felt like a desert that had lost its last oasis to theological drought. "We? Who is we?" he whispered. The angel's form expanded, fracturing the candlelight into patterns that would later haunt Aurelio's dreams. "The ones who terrify," the voice said. "The ones they tried to forget. The first angels." And just as Aurelio felt the full weight of that revelation beginning to crush his understanding of everything he thought he believed, everything flickered, faded, folded back into silence. The angel was gone. The candles steadied. The chapel looked once again like a place where nothing exciting had happened in centuries. Aurelio sat frozen, wondering whether he should report this or pretend it never occurred. He considered telling the abbot, but the man was notoriously bad at believing anything that required imagination. He considered writing it down, but his handwriting was so illegible that any record would be considered an act of medieval sabotage. And so, as many spiritual pioneers do when faced with overwhelming evidence, Aurelio decided to ignore it until ignoring became impossible. But deep within the monastery walls, something stirred. Something older than canon law, something brighter than stained glass, something the church had once known intimately, and then quite sensibly chosen to fear. It began, quietly, inevitably, like the first crack in the facade of certainty. And you, listening in your dim room, with the faint hum of night surrounding you, you felt it too, didn't you? That gentle, unsettling nudge, as though some unseen being has leaned close enough to whisper, "Pay attention. They have returned. Now breathe." The story is only beginning. If you have ever visited a monastery built too close to a cliff, you'll know that faith tends to grow in proportion to the risk of falling off. The monastery of San Aurelio del Silencio, named, ironically, long before Brother Aurelio was born, and long before silence became more of a hope than a reality, stood like a stone rib piercing the sky. The building clung to the rock with the stubbornness of a saint who refuses to retire, its narrow windows blinking against the cold like tired eyes that had seen too many confessions and not enough miracles. It was a place where the walls exhaled centuries of incense, dust, and unspoken regrets, where every step echoed with a kind of monastic rhythm, as though the floors themselves had memorized the prayers better than the monks who walked upon them. You could almost hear history muttering under its breath, annoyed at yet another generation trying to interpret the divine with insufficient footnotes. Aurelio had lived in this place so long that he often confused his own memories with those rumored to haunt the chapel. He was not an extraordinary monk. No dramatic vows, no martyrdom potential, not even a particularly noteworthy sense of spiritual discipline. In fact, if a saint ever attempted to adopt him as a personal project, they would likely have returned him to heaven's lost and found after 3 days. He was quiet, yes, but not out of contemplative depth, more because he never knew what to say when theology became competitive. He was devout, but only in the way one becomes devout after enough years of doing something that begins to look like meaning. He prayed faithfully, although, if one were to observe closely, he prayed the way one breathes while bored, automatically, rhythmically, and with brief moments of wondering if it mattered. His daily routine was a masterpiece of predictable piety. Dawn bells, a polite reminder that holiness demands waking up at unreasonable hours. Morning psalms, chanted with the enthusiasm of men who have accepted that singing badly for God is still considered service. Breakfast, porridge thick enough to humble even the ambitious. Work hour, usually sweeping, because the monastery's floors collected dust with the determination of a theological argument collecting interpretations. Midday prayers, a ritual meant to elevate the soul, though Aurelio mostly just elevated his eyes to keep from dozing off. Evening silence, which was never truly silent, because monks whisper more than they admit. In all of this, Aurelio moved like a man following footsteps he hadn't chosen, but had learned to trust. The monastery around him breathed a slow, contemplative rhythm. Even the shadows seemed devout, kneeling along the edges of the corridor as though waiting for absolution. The stone hallways were cold, always cold, because warmth would have been too comforting, and comfort, as tradition dictated, was spiritually suspicious. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries depicting saints whose faces suggested severe constipation rather than holiness, and angels rendered with such questionable anatomy that even the monks joked they must have been drawn by someone who had never actually seen one, which, of course, was exactly right. The scent of incense drifted everywhere, saturating the air like an overly enthusiastic metaphor. Sometimes it mingled with wax, sometimes with damp stone, sometimes with the faint, unidentifiable smell that only extremely old religious buildings possess, a smell that whispered, "Something sacred happened here once, probably." Yet for all the solemnity, the monastery had its peculiar charm. For example, the Chapel of Reluctant Revelations, named unofficially by the monks after a long history of prayers that resulted in precisely nothing. Or the Cloister of Hesitant Faith, where Brother Matteo once claimed he saw a miracle, but later admitted it might have been a trick of sunlight or indigestion. Or the Garden of Repentant Tomatoes, where the tomato vines grew with inexplicable guilt. Aurelio found peace in these places, though he was never quite sure whether it was spiritual peace or simply the numb comfort of familiarity. He liked sitting by the cloister fountain, listening to water drip in monotonous surrender. He liked sorting the library scrolls, even though half were unreadable, and the other half contradicted each other. He liked lighting candles, watching the flames tremble like uncertain believers. But more than anything, he liked the evening hours, when the monastery grew dim, and the shadows stretched long and sincere, and the monks wandered quietly as though afraid to disturb the dust. There was something soft in that darkness, something that felt devotional in a very human, very imperfect way, and Aurelio was imperfect in all the right ways. Several times he had been caught dozing during meditation. Once he accidentally swept a relic off a shelf. He apologized profusely to both God and the dustpan, and he had a terrible habit of asking theological questions at the wrong moment. Questions like, why does the divine feel more silent when I try harder to hear it? Do angels ever get bored of watching us fail? Why does incense always smell different when I'm doubting? Is God laughing at us? The abbot hated these questions. He believed mystery should remain unpoked, like a sleeping bear, or an unresolved doctrine. Aurelio, unfortunately for everyone, was a natural poker of mysteries. Yet despite all his doubts, or perhaps because of them, Aurelio had a strange, quiet sincerity that made the other monks trust him. They came to him when they needed someone who could listen without judgment. They confessed their secret boredom, their occasional doubts, their fleeting temptations to abandon the monastery and open a bakery. Aurelio never scolded. He simply nodded, as though all struggles were equally valid entries in the grand ledger of the human soul. And so, when he walked through the monastery the morning after the angelic encounter, eyes slightly wider, steps slightly slower, breath slightly more self-conscious, the other monks noticed nothing. For them, Aurelio always looked like a man who had recently misinterpreted a mystical sign or misplaced a theological insight. The monastery routine rolled forward. Bells, chants, porridge, dust, incense, silence. The abbot lectured the novices on humility, using a tone noticeably lacking in humility. Brother Matteo tripped over a cat that no one admitted lived in the monastery. Brother Tomas meditated so deeply that everyone agreed he might actually be asleep. And among all this, Aurelio wandered half-dazed, half-terrified, replaying the angelic words in his mind, "Where is your church? This is not the church. This is where it hides from the angels." What could that possibly mean? The monastery was the church, or at least a piece of it, a fragment, a stubborn architectural footnote. Angels were supposed to admire places like this, not criticize their zoning. And the first angels. Aurelio tried not to think about what that implied. His imagination helpfully suggested images of ancient luminous beings with bureaucratic wings and unsettlingly direct gazes. Beings who loved humanity, yes, but also audited it. Beings who did not appreciate religious embellishment. Best not to think about it, Aurelio told himself. Best to pretend nothing happened. He swept the floor with extra devotion. He hummed hymns off-key. He avoided direct eye contact with heaven. But the monastery felt different. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, like the air had been adjusted by an unseen hand. Shadows seemed more alert. Candles seemed too curious. The silence had a new tone, as though listening for an echo it wasn't supposed to hear. Even the dust motes floating in the morning light seemed to shimmer differently, like tiny celestial spies pretending to be particles. Aurelio kept glancing at the chapel door, half expecting the angel to return, half praying it wouldn't. because nothing disrupts a monk's routine like unsolicited divine intervention. Visions might sound glamorous, but they rarely respect schedules. He paused by the old wooden door leading to the cloister. His fingers brushed the handle. The metal felt strangely warm, too warm, as though someone who wasn't quite physical had passed through moments earlier. Aurelio stepped outside. The sky was cut into thin strips by the carved stone arches. Clouds drifted slowly, as though dragged by invisible chains. The wind carried an unsettling sweetness, like incense mixed with something older, something not meant for human lungs. He stood still, listened, waited. Nothing. But not the ordinary nothing of quiet mornings, a charged nothing, an anticipatory nothing, the kind of nothing that feels like a prelude to something you definitely did not ask for. Aurelio exhaled shakily. He whispered, "God?" Silence answered. But it was not the comforting silence he used to accept. It was a silence that looked back at you. A silence with posture. A silence that smelled faintly of judgment and old wings. Aurelio rubbed his face, muttering something profoundly theological like, "Oh, no, 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 no," and walked away quickly enough to suggest spiritual fear, but slowly enough to remain polite. He thought, perhaps foolishly, that he could outrun whatever was beginning. That if he immersed himself deeply enough in monastic errands, scrubbing, organizing, chanting, the universe might forget it had started something with him. But the universe never forgets, especially not when angels are involved. And so Aurelio trudged through the day, haunted not by the angel itself, but by the implication that everything he thought he understood about holiness had just been politely set on fire. For the first time since taking vows, Aurelio wished the monastery had a manual titled, "What to Do If an Angel Shows Up and Says Your Entire Religious Institution is Mislabeled." Sadly, no such manual existed. It probably should have. And as night approached once more, Aurelio felt the shadows sharpening around him, the way ink sharpens on old parchment. Something was stirring again. Something winged, something ancient, something entirely uninterested in whether a simple monk was emotionally prepared. That night, the monastery would learn, slowly, quietly, reluctantly, that heaven's visitors were not always gentle. And Aurelio, poor Aurelio, he would soon discover that doubts become much heavier when angels begin them. Before Aurelio's faith cracked like a porcelain saint dropped during an overly enthusiastic procession, it had been, at least in his own estimation, a gentle, dependable, almost domesticated thing. His faith was not the roaring, mountain-moving variety that prophets bragged about. No, Aurelio's faith was more like a well-behaved house pet, comforting, loyal, occasionally shedding in inconvenient moments, and perfectly content as long as no one asked it to perform miracles on command. And he loved it that way. He believed in God with the soft conviction of a man who had never personally experienced divine fireworks, but assumed, politely, that someone somewhere must have. His belief was stitched together from childhood stories, candlelit evenings, and the quiet pressure of belonging to a community where skepticism was tolerated only if it rhymed with mysticism. Aurelio never fought with his faith. He negotiated with it, the way one negotiates with an ancient, slightly out-of-touch relative who insists on offering advice that hasn't been updated since the Old Testament. He imagined the divine as a patient tutor who occasionally forgot to show up to class but always left encouraging notes on the blackboard. Notes like, "Have courage," or "I exist." Probably, or please stop asking for signs during meals. Aurelio's heart was a small chapel built inside his chest, complete with creaky doors and a perpetually smoking incense burner. His prayers were not grand. They were whispered apologies, tiny hopes, modest petitions for clarity delivered in the tone of someone requesting a favor they weren't fully convinced they deserved. He prayed not with fire, but with habit. He believed not in miracles, but in the idea of miracles, which was much easier to maintain. Actual miracles, after all, demanded explanation. The idea of miracles only demanded reverent nodding. Still, to Aurelio, faith had always been a beautiful thing. Beautiful in the way an old manuscript is beautiful. Faintly illuminated, slightly smudged, showing evidence of constant handling. His faith was full of little metaphors and poetic shortcuts. He once told a novice that believing in God felt like listening for a harp in a thunderstorm. You're pretty sure you heard something, but you can't prove it wasn't just wishful thinking. The novice had stared at him in awe, convinced Aurelio was a mystical genius. Aurelio himself later admitted privately that he had been half asleep when he said it. He believed in angels, too, though in a rather practical, administrative sense. Angels, he imagined, were the celestial equivalent of messengers working overtime, underappreciated, overworked, and prone to losing patience with humans who prayed too vaguely. He pictured them as glowing civil servants who occasionally descended to earth to resolve misunderstandings and remind prophets to phrase things carefully. He assumed angels were majestic, yes, but also slightly exhausted. Heavenly beings who wanted nothing more than to deliver a message and return home before someone attempted to worship them without filling out the proper paperwork. This was the quiet theology that lived inside Aurelio. God was benevolent. Scripture was meaningful. Miracles were rare, but tasteful. And the universe, though confusing, had the decency to behave predictably most of the time. It wasn't that Aurelio lacked depth. No, his faith was sincere. It simply wasn't dramatic. He believed the way some people collect coins, steadily, politely, without expecting the collection to suddenly come to life and yell at them. He liked rules because they made holiness measurable. He liked rituals because they were choreographed certainty. He liked the idea that being good was, in essence, just following a set of celestial instructions without smudging the ink. And he was good at following instructions. Or at least he tried. When others questioned doctrine, Aurelio nodded thoughtfully and pretended he understood the question. When others fasted, Aurelio fasted too, though privately he wondered whether God truly needed humans to be hungry to prove devotion. When others spoke of visions, Aurelio listened with awe and only a little suspicion. If someone claimed a miracle occurred, Aurelio didn't ask for evidence. He asked for the timestamp, just to make sure he hadn't been in the wrong corridor when it happened. He never asked for signs. He never demanded proof. He never expected anything supernatural to interrupt the orderly march of his quiet spiritual life. His faith, before it ruptured, was humble. It leaned heavily on borrowed wisdom, like a pilgrim leaning on a walking stick someone else carved. Whenever doubts came, and they did, sneaking in with the gentleness of dusk, Aurelio handled them delicately. He held them up to the light like strange stones, examined them, and then placed them neatly beside his belief, where they became part of the architecture rather than threats to it. He thought doubt was natural, healthy, inevitable even. As long as it didn't raise its voice, his relationship with God was a soft dialogue, carried out mostly in whispers. He prayed not to change the world, but to better understand why it was so stubborn. He confessed mistakes that were hardly sins, and apologized for thoughts he hadn't even fully articulated. And in the still moments, those thin hours when time felt translucent, he believed he felt something holy moving through him. Perhaps it was only the wind. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother's bedtime stories. Perhaps it was a misfired nerve. But Aurelio preferred to think it was grace. He believed God was gentle. He believed angels were distant. He believed heaven was orderly. He believed the church, though flawed, was essentially correct in everything it attempted to label as truth. These were comfortable beliefs, embroidered beliefs, beliefs that aged well in dim candlelight. And so, before the angel appeared, Aurelio walked the stone halls with a sense of stable devotion. He found joy in simplicity, sweeping floors, copying manuscripts, untangling theological metaphors the way one untangles knotted rope, slowly, patiently, occasionally swearing under his breath. He found beauty in repetition. He found comfort in predictability. His soul was a calm pond. His thoughts rippled only when the wind insisted. If someone had told him that his faith was fragile, he would have smiled gently and disagreed. If someone had told him angels would soon arrive and declare the church was hiding from heaven, he would have assumed they needed rest and perhaps some herbal tea. If someone had warned him that everything he believed was about to be delicately dismantled by celestial visitors, he might have laughed. But here is the secret truth hidden beneath the embroidered vestments of faith. Certainty is a luxury belief. It survives only so long as nothing too bright touches it. And Aurelio, poor trusting Aurelio, still lived in a world where he thought angels were beautiful and polite, that God communicated primarily through metaphor, and that existential crises happened only to monks in old stories who were conveniently dead and unable to provide clarifying commentary. He never imagined holy beings could arrive unannounced. He never imagined truth could sound like accusation. He never imagined faith could fail not because of evil, but because of honesty. Before the angel appeared, Aurelio believed he understood the rules of the universe, at least the general outline. He believed the divine was consistent, almost bureaucratic, operating on a cosmic schedule with minimal overtime. He believed that if a man lived quietly and prayed sincerely and obeyed obediently, heaven would reward him with gentle certainties. His faith was tidy. It was humble. It was domesticated. It was, although he did not know it yet, too small for what was coming. If faith is a house, Aurelio had built his out of thin wood and soft reassurances. If faith is a flame, his was a candle flame that never imagined the existence of lightning. If faith is a journey, his was a quiet walk on a predictable path, carefully avoiding any strange footprints. He loved his faith. He trusted it. He depended on it. And like so many before him, he mistook comfort for certainty. Yet certainty, when pressed by truth, cracks like brittle glass. And the angel, oh, that unwelcome visitor of wings and judgment, had come not to comfort, but to press. It would be wrong to assume Aurelio's faith shattered instantly. No, the divine rarely moves that efficiently. It fractures first, like ice in spring. A tiny sound, a small doubt, a hairline crack in the glass, a whispered question that refuses to leave. But before all that, before the tremors, before the collapsing, before the existential unraveling, Aurelio lived with the gentle, poetic conviction that God was near. Angels were orderly, and he himself was too insignificant to attract celestial attention. He believed he understood faith. He believed faith understood him. He believed both were mutually agreeable arrangements. And so, the night before, the angel shattered the quiet monastery air with its unsettling presence. Aurelio fell asleep, serene, confident, blissfully unaware that his carefully curated spiritual worldview was about to be audited by beings older than doctrine, and far less patient than Scripture implied. He slept like a man whose faith was a warm blanket. He dreamed like a man who trusted heaven. He breathed like a man untouched by cosmic irony. And oh, how irony waited! How it hovered above him, trembling like a candle flame before a storm. How it prepared to descend in wings and fire and unsettling truths. But Aurelio did not know. Not yet. Soon, but not yet. Doubt, despite its reputation for subtlety, rarely enters the human soul quietly. It prefers strange disguises, awkward timing, and the kind of dramatic flair theologians politely ignore in their homilies. For Aurelio, doubt didn't arrive through philosophy, nor through sin, nor through any tempting worldly distraction. No, his doubt arrived through a whisper he wasn't sure he heard, from a being he wasn't sure he saw, speaking a truth he wasn't sure he wanted. The morning after the angelic encounter, the monastery looked painfully normal, as though normalcy itself were an act of defiance. The bells rang with their usual metallic complaint. The monks shuffled into the chapel, yawning piously. Someone sneezed during the opening psalm and apologized to God for disrupting the liturgical mood. It could have been any morning from the monastery's long, repetitive history. Except Aurelio's heart was no longer synchronized with the bells. He felt something foreign inside him, like a draft running through a room that had always been sealed. His prayers hovered uncertainly, landing nowhere, and the memory of the angel, sharp, vast, uninvited, echoed through his mind with the persistence of a ghost that refused to recognize visiting hours. He knelt on his usual board in the chapel. The wood creaked, it always did. But this morning the creak sounded almost expectant. The candles trembled in their sconces, though there was no breeze. And when the abbot began chanting, Aurelio swore he heard a second, impossible voice murmuring beneath the human one, a voice that did not belong to the earthly world or the comfortable realm of religious routine. Aurelio tried to dismiss it. He tried very hard. He recited prayers with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a man overcompensating for spiritual cracks. He bowed lower, spoke louder, breathed deeper. Every gesture sharpened into a theatrical version of itself as though the sincerity had wandered off and left performance in charge. Focus, he told himself. It was a dream, a hallucination, a trick of the candlelight, perhaps too much incense. But incense, for all its powers, did not typically produce divine auditors, demanding clarification about ecclesiastical architecture. The chanting reached its midpoint, the predictable rise and fall that usually lulled Aurelio into a peaceful monotony. Yet today, the chant felt hollow, like an echo imitating itself. Aurelio lifted his eyes toward the stone altar, noticing something he had never truly seen before: the cracks in the marble. The altar had always been cracked. Everyone knew this. But this morning the cracks looked off, sharper, deeper, as though something were pushing from beneath or waiting or listening. And then it happened. A sound, barely audible. A low, humming tremor that rippled through the stone floor like a sigh too ancient to belong to any mortal creature. Aurelio stiffened. None of the other monks reacted. No one looked disturbed. No one paused their chanting. No one even blinked. It was as if the sound had singled him out. His chest tightened. The angel's words returned in a sharp whisper, "Where is your church?" This is not the church. This is where it hides from the angels. Hide from angels. That made no theological sense. Angels were protectors, messengers, holy. They were the celestial equivalent of guidance counselors. No one hid from them, except, apparently, the church, which was news to everyone, including the church itself. Aurelio squeezed his eyes shut. "Stop," he murmured under his breath. But doubt had already begun unbuttoning the seams of his faith. After the service, Aurelio escaped into the cloister, needing air or silence or divine clarification, whichever arrived first. The sky was gray, an uncommitted shade that refused to decide between blessing and omen. The wind brushed past him with the faint scent of old parchment and something sharper, something like celestial metal. As he walked, he replayed the angel's appearance, wings like fractured light, eyes that seemed to carry too many centuries, a presence that made every candle in the chapel recoil. He remembered its question. He remembered his pointing. He remembered, most painfully, its disappointment. This is not the church. How could that be? The monastery existed purely for prayer. It was carved from devotion itself. If this wasn't the church, then what was? He stopped near the fountain, gripping the cold stone rim with trembling fingers. Water trickled weakly from the spout, sounding strangely hesitant. "Why me?" Aurelio whispered. "Why now? And why? That message." A breeze twisted through the courtyard, brushing the surface of the water. Ripples formed, not chaotic, but patterned, too patterned. A circle inside a circle, inside another circle, as though something were marking a target. Aurelio stepped back. "No," he said. "No, no, no. This is nothing." But his voice sounded like a lie spoken to a friend who already knew the truth. The water stilled, and then, impossibly, a whisper rose from its surface, not through sound, but through impression, like a meaning delivered without words. You heard what you were not meant to hear. Aurelio stumbled further back. His heart thudded unevenly, like a drum played by a nervous novice. "No, I'm imagining things." He pressed a hand to his head. "I'm tired. I'm stressed. I'm spiritually dehydrated. This is absurd." But the whisper had changed something in him, because deep within his chest, beneath the layers of habit and ritual and borrowed certainty, something tiny and sharp twisted. Doubt, the real kind, the dangerous kind. Aurelio wished desperately to put it back where it belonged, quiet, theoretical, safely ignored. But it had already taken root, and doubt, once rooted, grows with the enthusiasm of wild ivy. It climbs, it spreads, it reshapes everything it touches. Aurelio closed his eyes and exhaled. Something had begun. Something he didn't want. Something he didn't understand. And worse, something he could no longer ignore. Aurelio did what any spiritually responsible monk would do in a moment of creeping metaphysical dread. He briskly walked away from the fountain, as if he were late for a scheduled appointment with sanity. The monastery hallways offered their usual refuge, narrow corridors where dust collected like shy parishioners, and where the soft groaning of wooden beams provided a soundtrack of gentle architectural suffering. Normally, these halls calmed him. Today, they felt too narrow, as though the walls had moved slightly inward to listen better. He passed Brother Matteo, who was carrying a stack of mismatched bowls, with the solemnity of a man transporting holy relics. Matteo glanced at Aurelio briefly before muttering, "You look pale." "I feel fine," Aurelio lied with the conviction of a man who did not feel fine. "You sure? You look like someone just told you the apocalypse was rescheduled for this afternoon." Aurelio attempted a smile, but achieved only the vaguest shape of one. just tired. Matteo nodded sympathetically. Ah, yes, monastic exhaustion. The body grows weary, and the soul files complaints with management. Normally, this kind of dry humor from Matteo would make Aurelio chuckle. Today, it struck him with uncanny accuracy. Did souls file complaints? Could they? Were angels involved in that process? Aurelio didn't want those questions. Not today. He hurried on. He made it to the scriptorium, the room where silence went to die slowly and politely. Monks sat hunched at wooden desks, copying ancient texts with the careful reverence of men who feared divine retribution for misspellings. Ink pots glistened like tiny shadow pools. Candle flames trembled as if gossiping among themselves. The smell of parchment filled the air, dry, dusty, comforting in a nostalgic sort of way, like memories that never actually happened. Aurelio sat at his usual desk, dipped his pen, and attempted to focus. Ink, word, stroke, letter, silence. His hand moved, but his mind wandered back to the angel. The weight of its presence, the sharpness of its message, the way reality had seemed too thin around it. He tried to copy a line about divine mercy, but inadvertently wrote divine mystery instead. This was not theologically inaccurate, but the novice next to him gasped as though Aurelio had rewritten the 10 Commandments in chalk. He crossed it out. He started again. He wrote the wrong word again. His hands trembled. Calm down, he told himself. It was just a moment. Just a strange encounter. Don't let it grow. But doubt doesn't need permission to grow. It feeds on the smallest cracks in certainty, like moss feeding on stone. Aurelio's heartbeat slowed into a heavy rhythm. Thump, pause, thump, like a hesitant knock on a forbidden door. He pressed a palm to his chest, trying to steady himself. Ink continued to drip from his quill. A soft, persistent tapping, almost like a pulse not belonging to him. He set the quill down. Maybe fresh air would help. Real fresh air, not the kind that smelled faintly of sanctified dust and ancient guilt. He slipped outside through the back doorway, stepping into the garden behind the monastery. It was a modest sanctuary, a square of earth fenced in by wiry vines and lined with herbs meant to heal illnesses both physical and spiritual. Lavender, mint, sage, rosemary, plants that smelled like consolation and tasted like penance. The wind carried an uneasy hush. Birds were absent. Even the insects held their breath. Aurelio stepped toward the old oak tree at the far end of the garden, a tree so enormous and so knotted that the novices swore it was the reincarnation of a retired saint. He often prayed beneath it. Today, the tree felt like the only thing in the monastery big enough to hold his fear. He leaned against its rough bark, closed his eyes, listened, not for God, not for angels, just for something, anything that made sense. At first, he heard nothing but his own breath, shallow and shaky. Then a leaf rustled, then another, and then a whisper, not from above, not from within, but from somewhere in the narrow space between reality and imagination. You were not meant to see us. Aurelio froze. His eyes opened wide, scanning the garden. No one, just herbs, leaves, shadows. He swallowed. Who's there? Silence. Then, after a long, untenably slow heartbeat, you were not called. Aurelio stepped back until his shoulders pressed into the oak. He felt its age, its stubborn grip on the earth, its indifference to heavenly politics. He whispered, "I didn't ask for anything." "But you heard," the whisper replied. Thin as spider silk, sharp as broken glass. You heard what sleeping faith should not hear. Sleeping faith. Sleeping. Was his faith sleeping? Was that why the angel appeared? Did angels come to wake something? or to break something? His pulse hammered in his ears. "Show yourself," Aurelio said, trying to sound brave but landing somewhere between frightened novice and confused librarian. A soft laugh drifted through the garden, a laugh without humor, a laugh without warmth, the kind of laugh a ghost might make when discovering it was still dead. "We are not shapes for your eyes." Aurelio's breath caught. Then, "Why speak to me at all?" This time the answer came slowly, like a drip of dark honey, "Because the veil thins, and you stood too close." That sentence struck him harder than any sermon he had ever heard. The veil thins, between worlds, between truths, between what the church taught and what truly was. "No," Aurelio whispered. "No, no, the veil doesn't just thin. It stays where it is. It keeps order. It keeps humans comfortable." The whisper interrupted. "But comfort is not truth." The words sliced through him. His legs felt weak. His breaths grew uneven. Doubt coiled tighter inside him. A serpent awakened. "Stop," Aurelio pleaded. "Please." But doubt is merciless once awakened. It has excellent hearing. It listens for pleas, and it answers with silence. The whisper faded, dissolving like mist. The wind returned. A bird chirped nearby. The world resumed its disguise. Aurelio sagged against the tree, trembling. He didn't know what frightened him more, that something had spoken to him, or that something had bothered to stop speaking. After several minutes, he pulled himself together, or at least collected the pieces of himself that hadn't scattered like startled birds. He straightened, brushed dirt from his robe, took a breath. He needed explanation, guidance, reassurance, something written in clear ink and preferably endorsed by the church. Unfortunately, the only person who might be foolish enough to help him understand something he didn't want to understand was the abbot. "God help me," Aurelio muttered, then paused. "Actually, maybe not right now." And he walked, half determined, half terrified, back toward the monastery. Aurelio made his way through the corridor leading to the abbot's study, each footstep landing softer than the last, as though he feared even sound itself might betray him to whatever unseen presence had taken an interest in his soul. The hallway was long, narrow, and lined with portraits of former abbots, whose eyes had the unnerving habit of following passers-by. Aurelio tried not to look at them. They looked too judgmental, too aware, too stern, like men who had opinions about angels, but never the courage to write them down. He paused at the heavy wooden door of the abbot's study. Behind it lived the monastery's greatest earthly authority, Abbot Severinus, a man whose piety was rivaled only by his ability to make everything sound like an administrative failure on someone else's part. Aurelio raised his hand to knock, lowered it, raised it again, considered fleeing. Finally, he tapped softly. "Enter," came the abbot's voice, in the same tone he used for blessings and reprimands, authoritative, weary, and mildly disappointed in advance. Aurelio stepped inside. The study smelled of ink, candle smoke, and an undercurrent of mild frustration. Scrolls towered on every surface like precarious theological mountains. A single window cast thin lines of light across the room, illuminating dust that drifted lazily toward the floor with all the urgency of fallen saints. The abbot sat hunched over a manuscript, squinting with the intensity of a man attempting to decipher divine mysteries and poor handwriting simultaneously. Without looking up, he asked, "What is it, Brother Aurelio?" Aurelio opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The abbot sighed, deeply, meaningfully, in the way that suggested Aurelio's silence was somehow a personal inconvenience. "Well?" he asked. If you've come to confess, please be concise. If you've come with a question, please be brief. And if you've come to report a miracle—" He looked up at Aurelio's pale face. "Please don't. It's been a long morning." Aurelio swallowed. "Father Abbot, I need guidance. That much is obvious," Severinus replied. "What troubles you?" Aurelio hesitated. Bringing up angels was always tricky. Angels were acceptable in paintings, in scripture, and in abstract metaphysical discussions, but actual angelic activity tended to cause administrative headaches. The Church preferred its angels metaphorical, not interactive. He took a breath. "Last night," he began, "during prayers, something appeared to me." The abbot froze. Not a good sign. "A vision?" he asked cautiously. "An angel?" There was a long, careful silence. The abbot's expression shifted through several stages of disbelief, mild annoyance, cautious curiosity, bureaucratic dread, before settling into polite skepticism. "Describe it," he said. Aurelio did, or rather, he attempted to. But how did one describe something that did not fit into the neat categories of holy art? He spoke of wings like shifting geometry, of eyes that seemed too ancient to be contained, of a presence that felt less like a visitor and more like a summons. He described its question, its accusations, its disappointment. The abbot listened, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. When Aurelio finished, the abbot inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and said, in the calmest voice he could muster, "Brother Aurelio, have you eaten breakfast this morning?" Aurelio blinked. "Yes." "Are you certain?" "Yes." The abbot considered this unexpected obstacle to his preferred explanation. "Did you sleep poorly? Experience any headaches? Consume spoiled food? Inhale excessive smoke from last night's incense?" Aurelio shook his head. The abbot leaned back in his chair. "Brother Aurelio, angels do not simply appear. And if they did, they certainly would not ask architectural questions." Aurelio flushed. "I know, it sounds impossible. But I didn't imagine it." "Everyone imagines something," Severinus said gently, "especially when tired, especially when devout. The mind is quite capable of constructing heavenly visitors when it does not wish to confront earthly realities." "But this wasn't the mind," Aurelio insisted. "It spoke to me. It judged me. It judged the entire monastery." The abbot gave him a long, stern look. "Brother Aurelio, the monastery does not hide from angels." Aurelio hesitated. "Father, I didn't think so either." "And you still should not," Severinus replied. "You had a moment, a confusion, perhaps even a test of humility. But angels do not rebuke us for existing. They do not scold monks for praying. They do not comment on church architecture." Aurelio felt a flicker of frustration. What if this was a different kind of angel? The abbot's eyebrows twitched. "There are no different kinds of angels." Aurelio almost said, "I think there are," but decided against it. Severinus folded his hands. "My son, your duty is not to interpret strange experiences. Your duty is obedience, devotion, simplicity, faith. The moment you begin questioning shadows, you risk losing sight of the light." Aurelio nodded slowly, though the words slid across his doubt without anchoring to anything solid. "Return to your duties," the abbot said. "Pray, rest, and do not entertain illusions." Aurelio bowed. "Thank you, Father." "Of course." The abbot's voice softened. "And Aurelio, if you truly fear that something spoke to you, come to me. Do not let your imagination lead you astray." Aurelio nodded again and stepped out of the study. The door closed behind him with a hollow thud. For a moment, he stood in the corridor, eyes closed. The abbot did not believe him. No one would. And worse, no one should. He wished desperately that he had imagined it. But imagination did not leave ripples in water shaped like symbols. Imagination did not alter the wind's tone. Imagination did not whisper through the garden. Imagination did not judge him with ancient celestial disappointment. Aurelio walked slowly back toward the chapel, feeling the weight of doubt settling deeper into his chest. It was no longer a whisper, no longer a moment, no longer a crack. It was becoming a presence, a shadow, a second heartbeat, something that walked beside him. By the time he reached the chapel door, Aurelio felt as though the world had subtly changed its posture. The air seemed heavier. The candles seemed dimmer. Even the silence seemed to have acquired an accent he couldn't quite identify. He stepped inside, and there, standing where the shadows thickened near the altar, was a faint outline, too faint to be certain, yet too wrong to ignore. A flicker of wings, a tremble of light, a presence that hadn't truly left. Aurelio's breath hitched. Something whispered, not through air, but through bone, "The truth has found you." And then it vanished. Aurelio stood alone in the chapel, overwhelmed by a realization that felt like cold water poured into the hollow spaces between his ribs. Doubt had not come to test him. Doubt had come to claim him, and the seed was no longer a seed. It was sprouting, growing, blooming into something he did not have a word for. Something holy, or unholy, or worse, something true. He whispered into the empty air, "God, help me." But somewhere deep inside he feared that God had already begun stepping back, making room for whatever came next. The human soul has an extraordinary ability to deny the obvious, especially when the obvious is inconvenient, celestial, and faintly shimmering in the dark. Aurelio, poor, trembling, soft-hearted Aurelio, was about to demonstrate this ability with such enthusiasm that future chroniclers, had any survived the following weeks, might have used him as the definitive case study in spiritual avoidance behaviors. Morning arrived with an overconfident brightness that felt personally offensive. The sun spilled through the high windows of the monastery as if it had been waiting all night to mock the concept of introspection. The birds outside sang with suspicious cheerfulness. Even the monastery cat, who denied living there and refused to answer to any name, strutted past Aurelio with the arrogant swagger of a creature unburdened by revelations from beings older than mountains. Aurelio, meanwhile, looked like he had aged a decade overnight. Shadows sat beneath his eyes, not dark enough to indicate illness, but deep enough to whisper, "Something is terribly wrong." Yet as a dutiful monk he attempted something far more heroic than confronting truth. He tried pretending nothing had happened. He woke up early, even before the bells, in the misguided hope that if he outran the morning, it might not find him suspicious. He washed his face with cold water, scrubbing it with the fervor of a man attempting to erase a memory through cleanliness. He dressed himself neatly, pulling on each layer of his robe with ceremonial exaggeration, as though fabric could restore theological stability. And then he began his campaign of spiritual denial. Aurelio walked into the chapel with a posture so upright it could have been used to teach geometry. His steps were unnecessarily loud, as if making enough noise might scare off metaphysical visitors. He bowed dramatically to the altar, so dramatically, in fact, that Brother Tomas whispered to Brother Matteo, "Good heavens, he's going to snap in half." Aurelio pretended not to hear. He knelt in his place. He folded his hands with operatic sincerity. He inhaled, exhaled, inhaled again. He plastered on a smile so radiant, so painfully cheerful, that even the candles seemed to recoil from the glare. "Everything is normal," he whispered under his breath. "I am normal. The monastery is normal. The angel was metaphorical. Yes, a dream, a spiritual metaphor, a symbolic manifestation of internal conflict, nothing more." He nodded to himself with the kind of confident nod reserved for liars who truly want to believe their own explanation. The abbot began chanting, his voice echoing off stone walls like an ancient and slightly irritated echo. Aurelio joined in, pushing each syllable out with the enthusiasm of a man auditioning for the role of Most Devout Monk, 12th Century Edition. He prayed louder than necessary, faster than necessary, with so much commitment that even the saints in the stained-glass windows seemed uncomfortable. And if God were keeping score, which Aurelio sincerely hoped he wasn't this morning, Aurelio's rituals were performed with the unmistakable desperation of someone trying to spiritually distract the heavens. But denial, though creative, is rarely effective, especially in the presence of angels. Halfway through chanting, Aurelio felt the hairs on the back of his neck lift, first slowly, then all at once, like a warning spreading through the body before the mind has time to prepare. The air behind him shifted, not dramatically, not with divine thunder, more like a soft adjustment, the kind made by someone or something tilting its head to observe more closely. Aurelio's chanting faltered. No, not now, not again. He straightened. He raised his voice. He pretended he heard nothing, sensed nothing, feared nothing. He prayed as loudly as one can pray without being excommunicated. The presence behind him grew denser. He chanted louder. A monk beside him gave him a side-eye. The presence stepped closer. He raised the pitch of his prayer. Someone coughed awkwardly. Aurelio pressed on, practically yelling the final psalm verse like a man trying to drown out the sound of his own heartbeat. But celestial beings do not respect volume as a deterrent. They have existed through millennia of human shouting, war cries, protests, prayers, theological debates, and the occasional monk dropping a heavy book on their foot. One monk belting a psalm at full force was, if anything, a mild curiosity. A whisper brushed Aurelio's ear. "We are not gone." His soul attempted to escape his body. His body refused to cooperate. He choked on the next verse. His voice cracked. He coughed loudly enough to startle the surrounding monks. The abbot stopped chanting. Silence fell like a heavy tapestry. "Aurelio," the abbot said sternly, "are you ill?" Aurelio shook his head with excessive vigor. "No, Father Abbot, merely moved by the Spirit." Brother Matteo whispered, "Moved where? He looks like he's being evicted from his own body." Aurelio glared at him, or would have, if his eyes weren't currently wide with existential terror. The abbot sighed. "Please refrain from disrupting the sanctity of morning prayer." "Yes, Father," Aurelio croaked. But the whisper returned, this time sliding down his spine like a cold breath. "You cannot deny what you saw." Aurelio squeezed his eyes shut. He pushed the words away. He buried them beneath prayer. He forced his mind into theological neutral. But doubt, awakened and hungry, chewed its way through everything he tried to pile over it. When prayer ended, Aurelio stood quickly, too quickly, and almost toppled backward. Brother Matteo grabbed his arm. "You sure you're all right, Aurelio? You look as if you've just seen—" "Don't say it!" Aurelio snapped a little too loudly. Matteo blinked. "I was going to say, seen a ghost." "Oh." Aurelio forced a smile. "Yes, ghosts, exactly." which we also haven't seen. Definitely not. Matteo frowned. Have you been drinking the sacramental wine again? Aurelio hurried away before the conversation could become any more incriminating. He marched through the halls, muttering affirmations with the determination of a man trying to coach himself out of a metaphysical meltdown. It wasn't an angel. It was a shadow, a thought, a stress-induced hallucination. Shadows do that. Thoughts do that. Hallucinations do that. Angels do not do that. He nodded firmly. A tapestry on the wall fluttered. He jumped. Wind, he insisted, pointing at it. Just wind. There was no wind. The candles in the hallway flickered even though he walked several inches away from them. Draught, he insisted. There were no open windows. A statue of St. Bartholomew seemed to tilt its head. He nearly screamed. Optical illusion, eye strain, nothing divine, nothing supernatural, just atmospheric lighting. The statue remained tilted. He walked faster. Denial, at its peak, can become almost athletic. He scrubbed the refectory tables with such force the wood squeaked in protest. He mopped the hallway floor twice, then a third time, just to be thorough. He swept the cloister as though sweeping could somehow remove spiritual residue. He arranged candles in symmetrical patterns solely because order felt like a defense. And then, as a crowning achievement in denial, he attempted something truly ridiculous. He tried smiling at the sky. He stood in the courtyard, tilted his head upward, and forced the most cheerful expression any monk had ever inflicted upon daylight. "Good morning, heavens," he chirped, voice trembling. Lovely weather for, continuous faith. The sky did not respond. This, at least, was comforting. Aurelio nodded approvingly at the clouds. See? Nothing unusual, nothing watching, nothing whispering, nothing judging. Wrong. A sound crept through the air, not a whisper this time, but a faint harmonic resonance, like a distant choir rehearsing with too many voices and too few chairs. Aurelio froze. He shook his head violently. No, 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 that is not a divine choir. That is wind, or bees, or some kind of acoustic trick produced by the stone walls. The sound grew subtly louder. Aurelio clapped his hands over his ears. Not listening. The wind died. The monastery fell silent, and then a single feather drifted down in front of him. White, luminous, too large to belong to any bird that paid taxes to nature. Aurelio stared at it, his denial collapsing like a badly built theological argument. He muttered, "No, absolutely not. That is a paltry anomaly. A fluff displacement, a feather from—" He looked around wildly. From the monastery pillow supply. The feather shimmered faintly. Pillows did not shimmer faintly. Aurelio's breath quickened. He spun around. Nobody. Nothing. Just him and a feather glowing like quiet truth. He backed away slowly, hands raised as though the feather were a wild animal. "I'm not accepting this. I'm not. You can't make me. I choose reality, ordinary reality, non-angelic reality." The feather touched the ground. The earth beneath it trembled, just once, like a sigh. Aurelio stopped breathing. Then a whisper slipped through the courtyard, unmistakably patient and unbearably ancient. "Faith does not break when truth arrives, Aurelio. It breaks when truth is refused." Aurelio staggered backward. The feather dimmed. The air settled. The world pretended nothing had happened. But Aurelio could no longer pretend. His denial, brilliant, determined, acrobatic, had failed. And the angel, whether present or watching from some unseen vantage, had made one truth painfully, unavoidably clear. He could no longer hide from the divine, nor could the Church. If God ever wished to communicate clearly, He certainly chose the wrong century, the wrong monastery, and the wrong monk. Aurelio, whose soul now resembled a fragile clay cup holding far more water than it was originally designed for, awoke the next morning with the distinct hope that, perhaps through mercy or cosmic oversight, everything strange had ended. No angels, no whispers, no glowing feathers defying poultry logic. Just a quiet day of porridge, prayer, and sweeping the sins of centuries off the monastery floor. But heaven, as it often does, had other plans. Plans written not in thunder nor in fire, but in irritatingly ambiguous signs that could neither be interpreted nor ignored. Signs that accomplish nothing except the spiritual disorientation of the already emotionally compromised. Aurelio stepped into the hallway, robes dragging softly over cold stone. The corridor, usually placid in its monastic gloom, felt charged, like a confession waiting to happen. He noticed something odd immediately. The candles were already lit. All of them. Every single candle in the corridor, chapel, kitchen, scriptorium, refectory. All aflame. Though no monk had risen early enough to do the lighting, it was beautiful. And utterly terrifying. Aurelio inhaled and muttered, "Fire hazard," which, technically, was true. But spiritually, it was denial wearing an apron. He approached the nearest candle. Its flame flickered gently, casting halos of orange around the walls. Something about it shimmered. Not magically, worse, symbolically. He waved his hand over it, testing for drafts. Nothing. He sighed. Of course. Because why wouldn't the candles light themselves the morning after an angel tells me the church is mislabeled? He pinched the wick to extinguish it. The flame went out. The wick smoked. And then, whoomph! It lit again. Aurelio stared. The candle, if candles possessed personalities, looked smug. He extinguished it again. It relit instantly. He glared at it. It flickered back at him. He whispered, "Do not do this to me." The flame grew taller, as if stretching. Aurelio backed away and decided he didn't need illumination today. He hurried to the kitchen, hoping breakfast, humble, predictable, untheologically threatening breakfast, might restore his sense of normalcy. The monks had left the porridge pot simmering unattended. Aurelio lifted the wooden spoon, ready to stir. But the surface of the porridge was not porridge-like. It had patterns, circles, nested circles, like the ripples in the cloister fountain yesterday, except made of oats. "No," Aurelio whispered, "absolutely not. I refuse to accept prophetic oatmeal." The porridge bubbled softly, forming a shape that almost resembled, if one squinted, an eye. Aurelio set the spoon down, then stepped back further. He turned to leave. The spoon stirred itself. "No," he yelped, pointing at the pot. "No more unsolicited symbolism." Brother Matteo walked in, blinking sleep from his eyes. "You're up early. Talking to the porridge?" Aurelio stammered. "Just checking the temperature." Matteo sniffed it. "Smells fine." Of course it smelled fine. Heaven rarely delivers signs with foul odors. That would be too helpful. Aurelio remained silent as Matteo filled a bowl, completely unaware that breakfast had developed theological ambitions. Aurelio retreated into the hallway, determined to maintain his sanity by force of will alone. It lasted approximately 8 seconds. He passed a window and froze. Snow. Except it wasn't snowing. It was spring. Birds had re-emerged. Flowers were blooming. The weather was aggressively pleasant. Yet a thin drift of white flakes fell past the window. Aurelio leaned closer. He reached one hand out, catching a flake between his fingers. Not snow. Ash. Warm ash. Falling gently from a cloudless sky. Oh, wonderful, Aurelio muttered. "Now the weather is repenting." Brother Tomas approached, yawning. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Aurelio held out the ash. Tomas squinted. "Looks like dust. Dust. Everything was always dust. Holy dust. Heretical dust. Centuries-old dust that smelled like forgotten Latin. Dust was the monastery's default condition. But ash, falling in spring? Aurelio brushed it from his palm and murmured, "Please stop. Please stop. Please stop." He walked to the chapel next, because apparently he had not yet learned to avoid places where miracles, or threats of miracles, happened. He opened the heavy door. Every icon in the chapel had turned. Not dramatically, not grotesquely, just slightly, as though each saint had shifted its gaze overnight, as though they were no longer looking at heaven, but at the altar, at the center, at something or someone standing there. "Not again," Aurelio whispered. He stepped inside. The air shimmered faintly, not enough to be miraculous, just enough to be suspicious. He approached the altar slowly, hands trembling. He kept expecting an angelic shape to emerge from behind it. A wing, an eye, a whisper pressed into stone. Nothing. But the icons watched him. Their painted eyes, once serene, now felt alert, expectant, judging. Aurelio approached a statue of St. Lucia and gently pressed a finger to its marble cheek. "Stop looking at me," he whispered. The statue did not blink. It didn't need to. He backed away, nearly knocking over a candelabrum. "All right, I get it. Message received. The veil is thinning. Reality is melting. Angels are unionizing. But could you please be clearer?" Silence. Because signs, especially unhelpful ones, pride themselves on ambiguity. Aurelio fled the chapel. Next came the library, his last refuge of order. Books, scrolls, ink, the safest possible space. He entered the scriptorium cautiously, expecting at most an illuminated manuscript glowing with suspicious radiance. Instead, he found Brother Isidoro staring at a scroll with a frown so intense it could have excommunicated parchment. "What's wrong?" Aurelio asked. Isidoro pointed to the scroll. It updated itself. Aurelio blinked. "Updated? Yes. I copied this line yesterday. Today it's different." Aurelio's heart sank. He read the line. "Yesterday, the church is the house of truth. Today, the church is a house near truth." Aurelio nearly fainted. Isidoro shrugged. "Strange, isn't it?" Aurelio forced a laugh, thin, strangled, hilarious, absolutely hilarious. He walked away before he lost the last thread of his composure. By midday, Aurelio had encountered candles that relit themselves, prophetic breakfast, repentant weather, judgmental icons, self-editing scripture. Any ordinary monk might have panicked by the second item. Aurelio, however, had already crossed the threshold into the surreal calm of a man who accepts he is no longer steering his own life. He found himself in the cloister again, the center of his unraveling. The fountain bubbled peacefully, the water blissfully unaware of its involvement in celestial conspiracy. Aurelio sat heavily on the stone bench. "All right," he said to no one, or perhaps everyone. "I understand. Something is happening. Something I don't understand. Something I don't want to understand." Wind rustled through the ivy. "I get it. Truly, loud and clear, or rather, soft and unclear." Aurelio dropped his face into his hands. He felt like a man kneeling before the universe with a sign that read, "Please explain." Slowly, "I'm fragile." A breeze shifted behind him, soft, delicate, too deliberate to be wind. He didn't look up. "I am not turning around," he whispered. "Not doing that again. If this is another angel, please leave a message on the nearest symbolic object, preferably something non-threatening, like a leaf. Silence. Aurelio exhaled slowly. Then a leaf dropped into his lap. He closed his eyes. He didn't move. He whispered, "Of course." The leaf shimmered faintly, then dimmed, then fell still. He dared to look at it. There, carved with unnatural precision along its surface, were 3 tiny lines. "Look, listen, wait." Aurelio stared. "That is not helpful," he whispered. "Those are instructions for anxiety, not divine prophecy." He held the leaf up. "Look at what? Listen for what? Wait for what? Why can't you just say it plainly?" The monastery answered only with wind. He dropped the leaf and buried his face in his hands again. Unhelpful signs, he realized, were worse than no signs at all. No signs preserved ignorance. Unhelpful signs preserved madness. And Aurelio was beginning to understand, unwillingly, slowly, painfully, that heaven was not ignoring him. It was preparing him, or testing him, or tormenting him with cryptic spiritual riddles. He whispered to the empty air, "Why me?" A whisper, not from an angel, but from something softer, smaller, internal, answered, "Because you were listening." And Aurelio understood something terrifying. He couldn't stop listening anymore, even if he tried. By the time the sun cracked open the next day, Aurelio's soul had begun its quiet descent, or perhaps its ascent, depending on whether one believes enlightenment begins with illumination or with spiritual collapse. In Aurelio's case, the distinction was academic. Collapse and enlightenment, it turned out, could look exactly the same when experienced by a man already stretched thin by divine ambiguity. The morning bell rang. Its metallic voice trembled through the monastery like a tired angel shaking a rusted tambourine. Aurelio jolted awake, heart pounding. Sheets tangled around him as though he had wrestled with his dreams. Perhaps he had. His dreams were no longer restful or even coherently symbolic. They were becoming crowded. He had dreamt of wings, not soft wings, not innocent wings. Wings like storm-sculpted stone. Wings that folded around the sky the way a closing hand folds around a candle flame. He dreamt of voices speaking in languages too old for earth. Syllables shaped like stone corridors, vowels stretched across centuries. He dreamt of standing before an altar that wasn't an altar, beneath a ceiling that wasn't a ceiling, while something watched him, with a gaze heavy as falling stars. Now he awoke with a throat dry as parchment and a growing conviction that he was slowly being prepared for something he would not survive, or worse, something he would understand. He sat on the edge of his cot and rubbed his face. His fingers came away cold. "Calm," he whispered to himself. "Calm is holy." But calm, like all virtues, is difficult to practice during an active metaphysical crisis. He stepped into the hallway. The monastery, once so dependable in its monotony, now seemed to shift with every glance. Walls leaned, not physically but perceptually. Shadows lurked with expressive enthusiasm. The air held its breath. Aurelio walked toward the chapel with the gait of a man approaching a confession he did not intend to make. He still hoped the crisis would pass, that the angel had made a mistake, that cosmic bureaucracy would correct itself. He pushed open the chapel door and froze. The candles, so many candles, were arranged differently, not randomly, intentionally, in a spiral, a perfect spiral, a spiral that began at the far wall and coiled inward toward the altar, forming a pattern too precise for mortal hands. Aurelio stared. "Oh no," he whispered. "Not geometry. Anything but geometry." Brother Tomas walked past him, yawning. He didn't notice the spiral at all. He stepped directly through it. Candles did not react. Flames did not tremble. The spiral remained invisible to everyone except Aurelio, which made it worse. Aurelio rubbed his eyes. Maybe he was hallucinating. Maybe stress had given him the gift of selective surrealism. He blinked again. The spiral remained. And at the center, just above the altar, a faint pulse of light. 1 heartbeat. 2. Gone. Aurelio stumbled backward, heart slamming against his ribs. He needed air. Never had he needed air so desperately. He fled the chapel, nearly knocking over a novice who was carrying a tray of bread. "Brother Aurelio," the novice called after him. Aurelio didn't look back. If he stopped moving, he was certain his sanity would catch up to him and demand unreasonable explanations. He reached the cloister, leaned against a column, and whispered, "Please, enough, stop, slow down. I am not built for prophecy. I am built for sweeping." The wind circled him, gentle but deliberate. A petal drifted past him, another, then dozens. Except the monastery had no trees capable of producing such petals. They were white, thin, and luminous. Feather petals, or petal feathers. Aurelio reached out and caught one, warm, soft, buzzing faintly, like the quiet hum of a distant star. He dropped it instantly. "No," he said, "no symbols today. Close the heavens. I am unavailable." He walked quickly, almost jogging toward the scriptorium, the only room that had not yet participated in his spiritual disintegration, unless one counted yesterday's self-editing scripture, but Aurelio had decided to pretend that had not happened. He entered with forced confidence. The scribes were already working. Their pens scratched the parchment with the comforting rhythm of routine. The room smelled of ink and resignation. Aurelio exhaled in relief. Finally, something normal. He sat at his desk, dipped his quill, opened his manuscript, and screamed, softly, monastically, but still. On the page was a message written in ink he did not recognize. "Aurelio, stop running." He slammed the manuscript shut so loudly Brother Isidoro flinched. "Is everything all right?" Isidoro asked. "Yes," Aurelio said with the enthusiasm of a liar. "Perfectly, absolutely. Are you distressed?" "No. You seem distressed. I am spiritually thriving." Isidoro raised an eyebrow. Aurelio opened the manuscript again, slowly, prepared for anything, except what he found. The message was gone. Blank parchment. He let out a strangled noise. "Brother Aurelio," Isidoro said gently, "perhaps you need rest." "No," Aurelio replied, voice shaking. "Rest is when the dreams happen." This did not reassure Isidoro. Aurelio left the scriptorium and walked aimlessly through the monastery, hoping to outrun the divine. But heaven is notoriously good at pursuit. He found himself in the refectory, where Brother Matteo was arranging loaves of bread with the precision of a man attempting to impress God through carbohydrate geometry. "Aurelio," Matteo waved, "come help me. The loaves are oddly shaped today." Aurelio approached reluctantly. The loaves were indeed oddly shaped, specifically wing-shaped. Aurelio stared. Matteo poked one. "Do you think it means something?" "No," Aurelio said firmly. "Bread is bread. Coincidence." Matteo nodded slowly, unconvinced. Aurelio forced himself to sit. He tore off a piece of wing bread, stuffed it into his mouth, and chewed angrily, as though attempting to absorb the symbolism through digestion. But the bread tasted faintly of incense. Incense and something metallic. He swallowed. Wonderful. Even the carbs are prophetic now. The descent continued. At midday prayer, Aurelio couldn't focus. Every chant sounded doubled. Every silence throbbed with something watching. Every prayer felt hollow, as though bouncing off a wall that hadn't been there before. He knelt. He rose. He knelt again. His body followed rituals long after his mind abandoned them. He felt split, one part clinging to old faith, one part dragged toward new truth, both terrified. As prayers ended, he lingered in the chapel. "Why me?" he whispered. "Please, anyone, anything, why me?" A voice, not angelic, not earthly, but internal, rose from the quiet. "Because you noticed." Noticed what? The cracks. Aurelio looked at the altar. The cracks were deeper. He looked at the stained glass. The colors were duller. He looked at the candles. Their flames leaned toward him. His breath quickened. The monastery was unraveling around him, or he was unraveling within it. He whispered again, fragile as candle smoke, "What do you want from me?" Silence answered, but not ordinary silence, a silence that felt shaped, molded, intentional. Then a single candle at the far end of the chapel extinguished itself. Then another, one by one, until only the candle nearest Aurelio remained lit. Its flame rose, stretched and bent toward him, as if bowing in recognition. Aurelio shook his head. "I'm not chosen," he whispered. "I sweep floors. I feed the cat. I misquote scripture. I am unremarkable." The flame flickered. "We know." Aurelio flinched. "That doesn't help," he muttered. The flame danced. It was never about worthiness. Aurelio sank onto the nearest bench, head in hands. His crisis deepened, spiraling like the candle spiral in the chapel, pulling him inward, closer to something he did not yet understand. He felt tears forming absurdly. He wasn't sad. He wasn't joyful. He wasn't anything recognizable. He was unraveling like old thread. He whispered into his palms, "I am afraid." A soft warmth brushed his shoulder. Not a hand, not a wing, just warmth. Comforting, maddening, unavoidable. A whisper followed, barely audible. "Good. Fear means the truth is close." Aurelio lifted his head, eyes burning. He stared at the last candle. Its flame flickered twice, then extinguished. The chapel plunged into darkness. Aurelio sat there, breathing in the dark, his crisis complete, or perhaps only just beginning. There is a moment in every spiritual unraveling when the soul realizes it has crossed a threshold from which it cannot return, when doubt stops whispering and begins singing, when certainty collapses not with a bang, but with a subtle, almost polite sigh. Aurelio, trembling on the edge of that sacred precipice, had reached such a moment. The monastery felt different now. It was not that the stones had shifted. They remained stoically indifferent, but the air had changed. It carried a thickness, a hum, an expectancy, like a congregation waiting for a sermon no one wanted to deliver. The silence, once heavy but benign, now felt predatory. Shadows clung to corners with the devotion of old penitents. Light struggled to exist. Aurelio walked through it all as though drifting through a dream he had not chosen. His feet moved. His mind hovered somewhere behind them, stunned and gasping. His hands trembled in the sleeves of his robe. His heart beat with uncertain tempo. He kept thinking, "This isn't happening. It can't be happening. Angels do not remake monasteries. They do not bend reality. They do not follow monks. But they had. They were. And now they were closing in. The breaking point did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with quiet inevitability. It began in the refectory. The monks were eating lunch with the meditative solemnity of men who believed chewing too loudly might attract divine judgment. Bowls of porridge, hunks of bread, the occasional leaf of something green and penitential. Aurelio tried to join them, hoping the mundane act of eating would anchor him. It did not. Halfway through the meal, Brother Matteo nudged him gently. "You aren't eating," he whispered. Aurelio looked down at his bowl. The porridge was swirling, not physically, symbolically, spiritually, offensively. Patterns formed, circles and spirals and shapes that should not exist in food intended to nourish the humble. Aurelio blinked. The swirling continued. He lifted his spoon. The porridge rose upward of its own accord. He dropped the spoon. He stood. Abruptly, too abruptly, the monks around him froze. "Aurelio?" Matteo whispered. Aurelio stared at the bowl with the same expression a man uses when seeing his house rearrange itself. He pushed the bowl away and said in a voice trembling with panic, I need a moment." He fled before anyone could stop him. He ran through the corridor, heart pounding. Someone called his name. Another asked if he needed the infirmary. Someone else suggested a laxative. Aurelio ignored them all. He needed the chapel. He didn't know why. Only that crises, like frightened children, gravitated toward familiar dark corners. He burst into the chapel panting, empty, quiet, too quiet. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him, not by wind, by intention. The candles lit, all at once, in a blazing circle around the altar. Aurelio froze, breath trapped in his chest. Then came the sound. A hum, a vibration, a resonance that began in the stone floor and traveled up into his bones like a memory he didn't know he had. The air thickened and folded. Light gathered. Aurelio whispered, "Please, please don't." But heaven was not taking requests. The light intensified, not radiant, but sharp, like glass bending. Then it split. Forms emerged, not one, not two, many. Wings like fractured halos, eyes like distant storms, voices layered atop voices. They were not the angels of paintings, not the gentle harp-holding diplomats of scripture classes. They were old, uncomfortable, inconvenient, real. Aurelio fell to his knees, not out of reverence, out of collapse. His hands shook violently. He whispered, "What do you want from me?" A dozen voices answered, not in unison, but layered in impossible harmony. Truth. Aurelio shut his eyes as if darkness might make the moment less unbearable. Why me? I am no prophet, no saint. His breath broke. I am not ready. One voice separated from the rest, soft, heavy, enormous. You were never meant to be ready. Aurelio shook his head violently. No, 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 no. The candles dimmed. The angels moved closer. The floor beneath Aurelio cracked faintly, like stone wincing under celestial weight. Aurelio sobbed without meaning to. It fell out of him. Fear, grief, confusion, everything raw and unprotected. His faith, that once cozy tapestry, now lay unraveling at his feet. He whispered through, shaking breath, "What have I done?" The answer came like an exhale rolling over centuries. You listened. Aurelio lifted his head. Tears blurred the world. "You said the church hides from angels," he whispered. "What does that mean?" Another voice responded, older, deeper, like a canyon speaking. "It means truth was abandoned for certainty. It means faith became comfort. It means they forgot us, and forgot what we are." Aurelio's heart twisted painfully. The angels stepped closer. Their shapes flickered, not stable, not earthly. Aurelio backed away instinctively, palms pressed to the floor. "Please," he whispered, "I cannot carry this. I am one man, one monk, one small, frightened person." The central angel leaned forward, not physically, but through presence. Its voice dropped to a whisper that felt like wind passing through his ribs. "That is why you were chosen." "No," Aurelio whispered. "Yes. Why not someone wise, or brave, or willing? Because the willing are blind, and the brave are deaf, and the wise have forgotten to tremble." Aurelio's breathing grew erratic. He realized with cold clarity that he was shaking not from fear alone, but from the unbearable weight of recognition. He believed them. He didn't want to. He fought it. But he did. The angels spread their wings, or what passed for wings. Light fractured, shadow folded, the air groaned. Then all at once they spoke, not in harmony, but in a storm of layered meanings. Truth approaches. Prepare. But first, you must break. Aurelio sobbed again. No more. Please, I am breaking already. The angels' voices softened, almost tender. Not enough. Aurelio collapsed fully to the floor, his forehead pressed against a cold stone. His tears pooled beneath him. He felt something inside him tearing, not painfully but inevitably. His old faith. His safe faith. His curated spiritual home. The angels dimmed, their presence withdrawing slightly, as though granting a fragile mercy. Aurelio whispered into the stone, "I cannot do this." The oldest voice replied, "You can, because you must, because what comes next cannot be avoided, because the veil is nearly open." Aurelio lifted his face. "What veil?" he whispered. "The one your church locked shut." His breath hitched. "But why show me?" he pleaded. "Why not the abbot?" The angels pulsed faintly, as though amused in a sorrowful way. He stopped listening long ago. And then, the breaking point became complete. The angels vanished, not abruptly, not violently, but with a soft collapse of light, like dust returning to the earth. The chapel dimmed. The candles flickered out one by one. Silence returned, large, echoing, unforgiving. Aurelio lay on the floor, breath ragged, soul trembling, eyes wide with the unbearable clarity of a man who has seen the architecture behind reality and wishes he could forget it. He whispered into the empty chapel, "God help me." And for the first time in his life, he was not entirely sure God could. Silence, when it follows revelation, is not the silence one expects. It is not peaceful. It is not gentle. It is not the quiet after the choir stops singing. No, this silence was thick, swollen, almost sentient. A silence that seemed to watch Aurelio with the gravity of something ancient and disappointed. A silence that felt less like absence and more like aftermath. Aurelio remained on the chapel floor long after the angels dissolved back into whatever realm tolerated them. His tears had dried on the stone beneath his cheek, leaving faint salt stains that would confuse monks for centuries. His breath came shallow, uneven. His thoughts wandered like startled deer, jumping, fleeing, returning, circling, failing to find safety. The storm had ended, but its echo had not. At last, he pushed himself upright, limbs trembling, robes clinging to him like damp shadows. He sat with his back against the nearest pillar, hugging his knees, staring into the dim chapel as though hoping the architecture might offer an apology. The candles had all extinguished themselves. The stained glass looked darker than usual. The air tasted faintly of ash, faintly of endings. He whispered, voice raw, "I don't know what you want from me." His whisper fell into the silence and was devoured without echo. Slowly, Aurelio pulled himself to his feet. His entire body felt heavier, as though gravity had been rewired for him alone. He brushed dust from his robes in a gesture that was less about cleanliness and more about reclaiming some tiny fragment of control. When he stepped out of the chapel, the monastery met him with a strange stillness. The corridor looked unchanged, yet not unchanged. As though the walls exhaled when he entered, as though the floorboards withdrew ever so slightly beneath his steps, as though everything had been paused mid-breath. He walked slowly, deliberately, each footstep placed with the caution of a man moving through a memory that might collapse beneath him. He reached the courtyard, stopped, stared. The sky had taken on an unnerving shade, a blue too pale to be comforting, too bright to be real, as if it had been washed out by celestial hands, as if heaven had erased its chalkboard and forgotten to redraw the sun correctly. The fountain's water dripped in oddly timed intervals. Pause, drop, pause, 2 drops, pause, like a message he was unqualified to interpret. The ivy on the cloister walls rustled even though no wind moved. Aurelio swallowed hard. "Please," he murmured, "stop reminding me." But the world, now aware of him, refused obedience. He walked toward the fountain and sat on the stone rim. His reflection stared back at him, not distorted, but unfamiliar. His eyes looked older, bruised by truth. And beneath his reflection the water darkened, as though revealing a deeper layer that should not have been visible. He leaned closer. The water trembled. Shadows swirled. Shapes almost formed. Almost. Aurelio snapped upright, breath sharp. "No, not now. I am not receiving visitors." He stood, turned away, and walked rapidly toward the cloister door. But as his hand touched the iron handle, he froze. The silence behind him spoke, not through voice, but through presence. Something remains. Aurelio shivered. He turned back slowly. A single feather lay on the fountain's edge, not glowing, not floating, just resting. Its simplicity made it worse. He approached it cautiously, like a man approaching the last surviving evidence of a crime he didn't commit but might be punished for. He picked it up gently. It felt ordinary, soft, warm, wrong. He closed his eyes. Why leave this? Why leave anything? The feather did not answer, not directly, but Aurelio felt deep within his chest a soft, unsettling tug. Not a message, not a command, more like gravity, a pull toward something unseen. He dropped the feather. It fell silently, landing without a sound, a silence more unnerving than any noise. He backed away from it, slowly, very slowly. As he re-entered the corridor, he hoped the rest of the monastery would behave normally, that the monks, in their oblivious devotion, would provide a buffer of mundane humanity. He encountered Brother Matteo sweeping the hall, a simple act, a comforting act. Aurelio approached cautiously. Matteo looked up. "Aurelio, you look torn between crying and fleeing." Aurelio attempted a laugh. It came out strangled. "I am fine. You do not look fine. I am fine enough. Is someone hurting you?" "Only God." Matteo blinked. "Ah, one of those mornings." Aurelio nodded, too exhausted to elaborate. Matteo resumed sweeping. "If you need to talk—" "No," Aurelio said too quickly. "Talking makes it real." Matteo paused. "Aurelio, it already seems real." Aurelio closed his eyes, inhaled shakily, and whispered, "I'm trying very hard to survive something I don't understand." Matteo's expression softened, but he said nothing. Aurelio walked on. He passed the scriptorium. The monks were copying texts with their usual quiet devotion. But Aurelio noticed something chilling. Every single monk's quill stopped moving at the exact same moment. Perfect simultaneity, as though controlled by one nervous system. Aurelio froze. The monks blinked, looked at their hands, then resumed writing. They hadn't noticed. He stepped away in dread. He passed the library. Scrolls lay open on the tables, but the air around them felt thick, heavy, charged. Aurelio didn't enter. He passed the refectory. Bread was cooling on the table, but the loaves sat at strange angles, as though arranged by invisible hands in patterns only angels understood. Aurelio did not investigate. At last, he found himself outside the monastery's walls. The forest stretched before him, dark, vast, indifferent. He walked to the tree line, stopped, stared into the shadows. He felt an instinctual pull to step forward, to let the trees swallow him, to vanish into nature where angels, perhaps, did not bother pursuing monks. But something deeper tugged him back. Not safety, not duty. Something heavier. Something that hummed faintly when he tried to ignore it. He whispered into the forest, "You cannot want me. I am nothing." The forest answered with silence that seemed to tilt its head. He stepped back. He refused to run. Returning to the courtyard, he sank onto a bench. His body went slack. His mind drifted. His breath slowed. Silence wrapped around him like a shroud. Not hostile, not friendly, simply present. He whispered into that silence, "What am I becoming?" Silence shifted. Sediment settled. Dust swirled. Time hesitated. He closed his eyes. And in the darkness behind them he saw wings, light, shadows, a veil lifting, and something approaching, something neither holy nor unholy, something vast and ambiguous, something that would not leave him untouched. He gasped and opened his eyes. The sky above him wavered faintly. He whispered one final question. "Am I supposed to survive this?" The silence around him, rich, endless, too full silence, seemed to answer, "Survival is not the point." Aurelio bowed his head. The storm had passed. And now the silence held him in its terrible, tender, crushing calm. Revelation, in the stories of saints, is always described with too much confidence, too much certainty, too many shimmering details that fit neatly into doctrine. But real revelation, the kind that threads itself through bone and thought, the kind that visits the unprepared, is nothing like that. It is vague, inconvenient, half symbol, half madness, a riddle whispered under a locked door. And for Aurelio it arrived not with clarity, but with hunger. Not metaphorical hunger. Actual, mundane, embarrassingly human hunger. It had been nearly a full day since Aurelio last ate anything meaningful, and even then he had consumed his wing-shaped bread with the enthusiasm of a man trying not to taste a metaphor. Now his stomach protested loudly enough that a passing novice might have mistaken it for a distant thunderclap. Aurelio sat in the courtyard, his new unwilling sanctuary, while the sky dimmed into the kind of twilight that monks both feared and adored. The air thickened with drifting incense from the evening service. He had skipped it, of course. One does not attend communal prayer while mid-collapse. But hunger insisted. His stomach growled again, louder this time, echoing slightly off the stone walls. He sighed. "Fine, I will go eat." But nothing symbolic, nothing glowing, nothing shaped like wings or halos or existential dread. He rose to his feet, steady but tired, and made his way to the refectory with the caution of a prisoner approaching a familiar guard. The long wooden tables were empty, cleared after dinner. A single loaf of bread remained, left cooling on a plate with a cloth draped over it. Normal, simple, blessedly ordinary. Aurelio exhaled in relief. He approached the loaf and lifted the cloth. His blood ran cold. The loaf was perfectly ordinary, brown crust, soft interior, no unnatural glow or unfolding celestial geometry. A completely normal piece of bread, except, burned into its crust, subtle but unmistakable, was a pattern, 3 faint lines, vertical, parallel, uneven lengths, a marking that did not belong to bakers, a marking he had seen before, on the leaf in the cloister. Look, listen, wait. Aurelio set the cloth back down with the delicacy of a man placing a lid over something alive. "No," he whispered, "no more hints, no more riddles. If you want to tell me something, speak plainly. Stop using carbohydrates." His voice echoed. No one answered. He turned away from the bread, deciding hunger was preferable to metaphor. As he stepped into the hallway, something flickered in the corner of his eye. He turned. The bread was gone. The plate was empty. Aurelio blinked once, twice. He inspected the table. Empty. Wonderful, he muttered. Now the bread is sentient. A faint chill crawled across his neck as he realized something worse. He was no longer sure if the bread had ever been there. His sanity had begun to untangle just enough that the edges of reality softened like wet parchment. He pressed a hand to his forehead. Focus. Breathe. The world is still real. You are still real, probably. He stepped back into the courtyard. The night sky had fully settled now, casting the monastery in blue-gray tones. Shadows elongated. Candles flickered behind distant windows. The entire monastery seemed to pulse gently with its own uncertain heart. Aurelio walked to the fountain. He always returned here. He didn't know why, only that the air around the fountain felt thinner, like the boundary between worlds had worn down through centuries of whispered prayers. He sat. He closed his eyes. He breathed. The water murmured softly. Then the murmuring changed. Not sound, sensation. A subtle vibration rippled through the stone beneath him. A warmth pressed against his back. A glow brightened behind his eyelids. Aurelio whispered, "No, not tonight. I am weak. I am tired. I am not in the mood for ethereal instruction." The vibration continued. His heart thudded. He opened his eyes, and the world had changed. Not drastically, not impossibly, just enough to unseat him. The fountain water glowed faintly, not bright enough to illuminate the courtyard, but enough to reveal the depth of the pool in a way normal water never did. He stood slowly and stepped closer. Beneath the water's surface, shapes formed. Not clear shapes, not symbolic shapes, something between. Aurelio leaned in. The shapes shifted. A cross, a mountain, a doorway, a wing, a crack. Every interpretation fit. Every interpretation failed. Aurelio whispered, "What am I looking at?" The water rippled. Not from wind, from intention. Aurelio stumbled backward. "No, don't show me anything. Not unless you intend for me to understand it. I am too tired for riddles." The glow intensified, and then a sound, soft, gentle, a low hum like a lullaby sung by a weary star. It wrapped around Aurelio, warm and unsettling. He felt his knees go weak. His breath slowed. His mind drifted in and out of focus. He felt as though he were falling. Not physically, spiritually. Falling into something deeper than comprehension. Into a vastness inside himself he had never known existed. The hum grew louder. The water brightened. And then something spoke. Not in words, not in images, in feeling. Aurelio felt fear, sorrow, anticipation, loss. A door opening, a door closing, a choice approaching, a truth refusing to be ignored. He staggered, overwhelmed. Then he felt something else, hunger. His stomach growled loudly enough to disrupt the entire cosmological moment. The glow flickered. The hum stuttered. And for a bizarre, surreal second, Aurelio felt as though the revelation itself, whatever it was, had been interrupted by his very human need for dinner. He pressed a hand to his stomach, mortified. "I apologize," he whispered to the glowing fountain. "I am multitasking poorly." The hum dimmed as though sighing. Aurelio leaned heavily on the fountain's edge. "Please, just tell me what you want." The glow pulsed once. Aurelio waited. Another pulse. He held his breath. A third pulse. And then the glow vanished. The water darkened. The hum stopped. The courtyard returned to itself. Aurelio stared, aghast. That's it? That's the revelation. Pulses. What did that mean? 3 pulses of what? Agreement? Warning? Morse code? Silence. Aurelio raised both hands. Are you doing this on purpose? Are you refusing to communicate clearly out of some ancient celestial principle? Still silence. He groaned and sat heavily on the stone rim. Fine. Fine. I will interpret your divine Morse code myself. Let me think. He tapped his fingers. 1 pulse. Look, 2 pulses. Listen. 3 pulses. Wait. His stomach growled. Oh, he muttered. Or 3 pulses could mean eat a sandwich. He sighed and rubbed his face. Am I losing my mind? He whispered. A soft breeze brushed past him. Not warm, not cold, neutral, ambiguous, like the universe shrugging. Aurelio laughed, a weak, broken sound. Wonderful. Even the wind refuses to take sides. He leaned back, staring up into the dark sky. Clouds drifted slowly, shapeless, unhelpful. Stars flickered without offering guidance. The moon hid behind a curtain of mist as though uninterested in the evening's drama. Everything felt symbolic. Everything felt meaningless. Everything felt too close to truth and too far from comprehension. Aurelio whispered, What am I supposed to do with this? Silence. What is happening to me? Silence. What is coming? And from the silence, not breaking it, but altering it, came the faintest impression. Soon. Aurelio shivered. Not because he understood, because he didn't. And ambiguous revelation, he realized, was not meant to clarify. It was meant to prepare. There comes a point in every unraveling where the world grows too quiet. So quiet you begin to suspect the universe is leaning in, waiting to hear whether you will whisper a prayer or a surrender. Aurelio found himself in such a quiet, standing alone in the cloister, as dusk draped itself over the monastery like a ceremonial veil. The sky dimmed to a bruised violet. The first star appeared reluctantly, as if unsure it wished to witness whatever would happen next. The angels had retreated. The visions had blurred. The signs had quieted. But silence, this new, unsettling silence, was louder than any revelation so far. Aurelio stood by the fountain staring into water that no longer glowed, no longer hummed, no longer offered cryptic, cosmic Morse code. The courtyard looked almost normal again, almost mundane in its familiarity. But Aurelio was not fooled. Normalcy had become a costume the world wore poorly. The wind brushed past him, stirring the edges of his robe. He did not look up. He did not need to. He felt the shift. Something was returning, not wholly, not physically, just enough to distort the air. Aurelio whispered, Please, not again. But the universe, in its magnificent indifference, neither agreed nor declined. A soft tremor moved through the courtyard stones, barely perceptible. The ivy rustled, not from wind, but from recognition. Aurelio felt the faintest warmth behind him, neither threat nor comfort. Something in between, something like a reminder. He turned slowly, nothing visible, nothing dramatic. Only shadows, but shadows with intention. Aurelio swallowed. Are you here? Silence throbbed faintly, like a pulse felt through the wall of a closed room. He closed his eyes. I cannot carry more. I am tired. I am breaking. Please, leave me as I am. The shadows did not move, or perhaps they moved too subtly to notice. Aurelio continued. You said the veil is opening. You said truth is coming. But why must I be part of it? I am not a prophet. I am not wise. I am... His voice cracked. I am terrified. A soft warmth brushed his cheek, gentle, deliberate, unmistakably not the wind. Aurelio's breath caught. A whisper, Not a voice, not sound, but an impression rose around him like incense smoke. Fear is the threshold. He shuddered. Threshold to what? Silence. Why won't you tell me? He pleaded. The impression shifted, because knowing is not readiness. His eyes burned. Frustration, fear, sorrow, they tangled inside him like vines. Then why show me anything? Why give me signs I cannot interpret? Why appear if you refuse to speak plainly? The shadows thickened, gathering like a presence just beyond sight. To break what must break, the impression answered, before what must come arrives. Aurelio stumbled backward until he hit the fountain. The stone bit into his spine. He gripped its edge, grounding himself. His voice was barely a whisper. "Will I survive it?" The courtyard darkened slightly, as though twilight itself had paused to listen. Then the impression shifted once more. Neither yes nor no, but something like, "Survival is not the point." Aurelio closed his eyes, breathing through panic. Then what is the point? This time the answer came not through impression, but through feeling. Deep, heavy, ancient, witness. The word fell through him like a stone sinking into deep water. He opened his eyes slowly. The courtyard had grown still. The shadows had softened. The presence receded. The message had been delivered. Aurelio stood there trembling, suddenly aware of the terrible simplicity of his role. Not chosen to act, not chosen to lead, not chosen to save. Only to witness. And the irony, oh, the sharp, celestial irony, was that he had never asked for anything at all. He had only listened too closely. And listening, in divine matters, is a dangerous thing. He lifted a hand to his face. His fingertips were wet. Tears. He hadn't realized he'd begun to cry. He whispered, "What am I supposed to witness?" The fountain dripped once, twice, 3 times. Rhythmic. Intentional. He stepped back from the fountain. "No," he whispered. "Not this again. No more riddles." He turned away from it, breath hitching. The shadows stretched behind him. He felt watched, not by danger, but by inevitability. He walked toward the chapel, needing a place to breathe that did not feel alive. The monastery halls were dim now, lit only by the occasional sputtering candle. Aurelio stepped into the chapel and sat in the last row of benches. The wooden seat was cold, grounding. For a moment, one fragile, breaking moment, he allowed himself to collapse inward. His hands covered his face. His breathing trembled. "God," he whispered, "if you see me, if you hear me, I am begging you, please tell me what this means." Silence. He waited. Silence. He exhaled shakily. "Or tell me nothing. Just stay, please. Just stay, even if you say nothing." More silence, but not empty this time. Full, heavy, present. Aurelio felt it settle around him like an unseen cloak. Not comfort exactly, but not abandonment either. Something between. He lowered his hands. His eyes drifted upward. The crucifix above the altar looked different somehow. Not changed, not moving, just deeper. A shadow behind a shadow, a truth behind a truth. He whispered, "I am afraid." A quiet impression drifted through the silence. "Then you are ready." He trembled. Ready for what? The silence folded in on itself as if bracing. Then came a whisper, not from angels, not from God, not from imagination, but from some vast, ambiguous place between all three. Something is coming. Aurelio swallowed hard. What? Silence. How? Soon? Silence. He leaned forward, gripping the back of the bench in front of him. "Please, give me something to hold on to." And the darkness, soft, hush-tinged, tender in its cruelty, answered. Soon. Aurelio felt the words settle into him, become part of him, pulse through him like a second heartbeat. He nodded slowly. He did not accept it. He did not understand it. But it had become his fate. He rose from the bench, stepped into the aisle, turned toward the chapel door. And as he reached for the iron handle, feeling the world shift beneath the quiet breath of the unseen, he whispered, barely audible, "Whatever comes, I will witness." The door creaked open. The night exhaled. The monastery listened. And the story did not end. It simply stood on the edge of something vast, waiting. Night settled over the monastery with the deliberate weight of an old book closing, slow, inevitable, whispering something final, without offering any explanation. The stones exhaled their stored sunlight in a fading warmth. The torches dimmed into thin, trembling flames, and the halls slipped into that familiar darkness where dust moves more confidently than monks. Aurelio wandered through it like a man suspended between two worlds, steps soft, breath softer, heart stumbling through a rhythm it had not agreed to. He felt emptied, but not hollow, filled, but not whole. The aftertaste of revelation clung to him like incense that seeped into cloth, difficult to remove, impossible to ignore. He made his way to the chapel one last time, drawn not by faith but by habit, which is often a monastery's most persistent form of devotion. The door obliged him with a tired creak, the same old complaint it had made for centuries, grieving quietly under the weight of secrets it had absorbed. Inside, the darkness stretched long and unbroken. No candles glowed, no symbols stirred, no visions lingered. Just silence, deep, unadorned, contemplative silence. Aurelio stepped inside and felt the familiar chill wrap around him, as though the darkness were trying on his shape. He walked slowly toward the altar, footsteps tapping lightly, respectfully, as though not to wake whatever divine bureaucracy slumbered beneath the stones. He reached the front row and sat. The wooden bench sighed under him, the tired groan of faith doing its best. Aurelio looked up at the crucifix, its silhouette faint in the dark, carved from wood that had witnessed more prayers than any angel had bothered to count. The figure above him did not glow, did not move, did not whisper. It simply was, and perhaps that was the holiest thing it could be. He whispered into the quiet, "I don't know what comes next." A pause. "I don't know why you chose me." Another pause. "I don't even know if I believe half of what I've seen." Silence answered with its usual eloquence. Aurelio leaned back. His shoulders softened. His breath eased. "I suppose it doesn't matter," he murmured. "I don't need to understand the truth to witness it." He smiled, a small, worn thing, but sincere in its own exhausted way. "I'll be here," he whispered, "whether I'm ready or not." He could almost feel the silence smiling back. Then, just as he stood to leave, a faint breeze brushed across the chapel. Not warm, not cold, just present. A candle on the nearest wall flickered. Another flickered. Then another. One by one they ignited, softly, timidly, as though embarrassed to be caught doing something sacred. Aurelio froze. But this time he did not tremble. This time he did not flee. This time he did not deny or doubt or bargain. He simply watched. Watching was, after all, his new vocation. The candles glowed calmly. No spirals, no messages, no impossible geometry, just flame being flame. Aurelio exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure to whom. He turned toward the exit. His footsteps echoed lightly, like a soft epilogue spoken to the stones. When he reached the door, he glanced back. The candles flickered once, all at once, not a sign, not a warning, but something like a nod. Aurelio bowed his head. not out of fear, out of respect. Then he stepped into the corridor, where the night waited, still and patient. Outside, the moon coiled itself in a thin ribbon of light. A pale scythe hung in the heavens. The courtyard breathed faint fog. Dew clung to the stones. The fountain trickled with the hesitant rhythm of something deciding whether to speak again. Aurelio walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped beneath the moon's dim glow. He inhaled deeply, the cool air filling his chest, smoothing the jagged edges in him, and for one fragile moment he felt almost peaceful, balanced precariously between fear and readiness, between ignorance and revelation, between who he had been and who he was slowly, reluctantly becoming. A distant whisper drifted across his thoughts, not spoken aloud, not wholly internal, something suspended between realms. Soon. Aurelio smiled softly, not afraid this time, just awake. He whispered into the night, "I'll be here." Then he turned and walked back toward the monks' quarters, leaving behind the courtyard, the fountain, and the watching shadows. As he disappeared into the darkness, a single candle on a windowsill flickered gently, not as a sign, not as a warning, just as a reminder. Faith never truly ends, it simply changes shape. And that night, the monastery slept, but not peacefully, and not entirely alone. A single feather drifted down from nowhere, landing in the courtyard dust. It lay there quietly, half buried, waiting for whatever came next. And if you were to ask anyone who watched this monastery from the outside why its windows glowed so strangely that night, why its shadows stretched a little too far, why its silence seemed just a little too full, they might shrug, or cross themselves, or mutter something superstitious. They would not. No, they were not meant to, because Aurelio was the witness, and the rest of us, like monks outside the vision, are left only with the unsettling comfort that something is always approaching, even when we pretend it isn't. The candlelight trembled, the feathers stilled, the night inhaled, and the story remained unfinished, exactly as all true stories must. If this tale kept you awake a little longer tonight, if the shadows leaned in closer, if the silence felt heavier, if you sensed something vast just beyond the veil, then subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.